going to talk about the recent green crab explosion, which I'm actually calling the second coming, because tonight we'll be talking about green crab distribution and abundance and life history characteristics. We're going to go back in time to the 1950s to give you an idea of what green crabs were doing then. I'll talk a little bit about pilot studies in Freeport and my current work. So a little bit about the geographic distribution of green crabs. And they came from northern Europe to the United States in about 1817. And they came over on boats accidentally in the hulls of ships that were attached. In the hulls of ships were rocks that were used as loose ballast. And some of those rocks had seaweed like rockweed on it. And the same species of rockweed that we have here along our shores occurs in Ireland and in England and places like that. So this green crab was attached to some of those rocks, and these ships would come over, and not all of them would make it. Some of them would be scuttled and all of a sudden just kind of decay. Anyway, green crabs got here. They figure sometime around 1817 in Long Island Sound. And by 1905, they had reached Casco Bay. And from 1905 to, it took 46 years to reach Lubeck, but they did. And they did it the same way that they did it coming over from England and Ireland. And they did that because the tides, of course, are running from Lubeck towards Portland. So the net movement of water in the Gulf of Maine is from where I work down east to here. So it's interesting how green crabs have migrated against that tide, and it's all because of us and our grandparents and great-grandparents and all of the marine commerce that was going on at that time. I call the green crab the consummate invader of marine ecosystems, and you'll be amazed at the kind of things that this green crab does, and by the time I get done listing these things, you'll have a better understanding of why the green crab has this ability to, it's in Tasmania, it's in Japan, it's in Maine, it's everywhere. Well, the females are highly fecund. A 2-inch female can have as many as 165,000 eggs, and the relationship between the size of the animal and the number of eggs it produces is exponential. It's the same relationship for lobsters and for other crabs, but we have the same relationship in green crabs. It's planktonic dispersal as a larvae, and I'll show you some photos in a moment. The larvae have a really high tolerance for fluctuations in temperature as well as salinity, but the adults have an even greater ability to tolerate temperatures and salinities. I had some green crabs in my lab for a marine ecology class a few years ago. Students were measuring the carapace using calipers, and I think one of them escaped. And a week later, when we went back to the lab for the next week, I said, well, what's that over there in the corner? And it was a green crab, so someone went over and picked it up, and the thing was just ready to fight. That was a week out of water in the corner of a room that was at 68, 70 degrees. So they have some pretty innate abilities. Adults, last year in Freeport, we were taking green crabs out of the water like nobody's business and putting them into black fish totes and putting white covers on them. And in the middle of the summer, sometimes they wouldn't get weighed for 2 or 3 days. One of them didn't get weighed for 10 days. This is in the middle of July. Took the cover off. They're just scurrying all over the place. So they're pretty amazing that way. Another reason why they can adapt so quickly is that they have really no preference for any particular habitat. You can find them in salt marshes and eelgrass beds. You can find them subtidally. You can find them intertidally. You can find them on the rocky shore. So they're ubiquitous. They have also a very diverse diet. They're omnivorous. They prefer shellfish, mussels, and soft-shell clams, but you can find eelgrass and cordgrass. You can find salt marsh grass in them as well. Polychaete worms, hermit crabs. Part of what we're doing in Freeport this summer is taking subsamples and actually excising the guts to find out whether or not eventually we think that they also may be preying on small lobsters. We have no evidence of that yet, but lobsters haven't settled yet, so we'll be looking at that. And then their gregarious behavior enhances the time that they can encounter the opposite sex. So if you're a soft-shell clam, this is what you don't want to look like, because this is the evidence of a green crab attack. That's in the Machias River, taken about 4 or 5 years ago. If we look at just a little bit more of their life history traits, they're done copulating in August. The egg masses appear anytime between July and November. Those eggs are carried over the winter and until the next May or June. Then they have a planktonic larval existence, and that can be as high as 82 days, a little bit shy of 3 months. The larvae settle in August and October. They go into that first winter somewhere less than 1/2 inch in carapace width. The maximum size is anywhere between about 3 inches, a little bit larger. They mate when they're around 2 to 3 years old, and their lifespan is 5 or 6 years, unfortunately. If we look at the hatching larvae, and these are photos that I have downloaded from Google. These are images that I have, I'm giving credit to these folks that provided them, but they're out there on the internet, so we can look at them. They have a zoeal stage where they look nothing like a green crab. So if you were to look at a rock crab or a Jonah crab or a green crab, at this stage you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And even most biologists wouldn't be able to. We have 4 zoeal stages where, again, these are looking not anything like green crabs at all, or any crab. These are there all the time, and I don't know, they just didn't really make it into this picture. This actually is part of what will become the walking leg, and these things right here are fine hairs. And what happens, and it's the same thing with larval lobsters, when they hatch, all of a sudden these things pop out. It would be like me attaching some styrofoam pieces to your arms and then kicking you overboard and saying, go ahead and sink. You'd never be able to do it. So these things actually are increasing their surface area and are allowing them to float in the water column. But the behavior, the thing that I was looking at, these are what are called pleopods or swimmerettes, and they appear at that zoeal stage. And then in all of these stages, they're shedding, they're molting. Okay, they're crustaceans, and so in order to grow, they have to shed. So the zoeal stage 4, going into the megalopa stage, is another shed, but a metamorphosis. So they're changing shape as well as molting. And this is an animal that's about 1.2 millimeters, very, very small. It's still kind of hanging around in the water, but it's going down to the bottom and coming back up again and bobbing around. It really doesn't know if it's a bottom dweller or whether or not it should be in the plankton. And then again it grows and it sheds again, and we end up with, that's my thumbnail, okay? And this is 5 millimeters from one side of the carapace to the other. So when I mentioned carapace width coming up in these other slides, that's what I'm talking about, is the greatest distance of the back or the carapace of these things. So this was a picture from Harpswell. This was in one of my experiments that I set out in April in Harpswell in 2013. And I picked up the experiment around the 15th of November. So this hadn't been settled very long. And this is the size that it would go into the winter, and it won't shed again until March or April of the next year. So a lot of the juveniles are going into the winter at that size. Oh boy, this is really tough, and I apologize. There's going to be a lot of slides where I've got some data points, and anyway, this is almost awful, but bear with me. So I'm going back in time. I'm going back to 1940 to 1957. And as you can see, from 1940 to about 1948, 49, the temperatures were slowly rising, but this is minimum monthly average temperature. What I did was I went on the DMR website, And they have the most amazing data set for seawater temperature at Booth Bay that was begun in 1905 with daily recordings and minor gaps the whole way. And you can download it as an Excel file. So I went in starting in 1940 and took a look at each month and what the minimum monthly temperature was. And some of these temperatures could have occurred in January. Some could have occurred in February. There weren't any in March. Some may have occurred in December. But regardless, I picked out the temperature that was the minimum for the average of a month. And I plotted these so as to look at what was going on between 1940 and 1948 or 49. And then something happened. And oceanographers are really, and I'm not an oceanographer, but we had one here this morning when I kicked the tires on this particular talk. And this kind of anomaly occurred, and there's really no real good explanation for it other than it happened, and then all of a sudden the temperature started to decrease. I'm telling you this because associated with this increase in seawater temperature, a paper that was written in 1955, and so it says, clam abundance decreased 50% in 4 years in study areas in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, even though fishing intensity was very low and reproduction was adequate. Clam population decreases occurred primarily in places where green crabs had become more abundant and in size groups which are attacked by crabs. Clam populations on commercial flats decreased from 1949 to 1954, and recent year classes are scarce or absent. Green crabs became abundant during this period, and this was correlated with the current warm cycle. Winter temperatures are important to survival of green crabs since they and their eggs are reported to be killed by a combination of low temperature and low salinity. Warm winters allow more crabs to survive. The future of the soft-shell clam industry depends on the temperature cycle or on the development of measures for controlling green crabs. And you know, we could have opened our eyes and read that on the front page of the Portland Press Herald today. The same thing. It's deja vu all over again. So this is one of my favorite pictures of all times. This is a picture taken in 1955 in the salt marsh up in Scarborough with a clam biologist extraordinaire named Dana Wallace, followed by some Marine Patrol people. And one of them is looking for, I don't know what, they thought they might find, but actually it turns out, Dana was telling me, that they used the hatchet to chop at the banks because what was happening is you could go up to one of these salt marsh banks and just do this and hear this inside the bank. And these banks were just loaded with green crabs marching around. And in 2013 in Freeport, this fellow here, Chad Coffin, wasn't using a hatchet to chop at the banks, but a clam hoe. And when he did, he was exposing these, the best word that I have for it is a brothel. It's 90% females and 10% males. And the males are, like this size, and the females are all this size, and they're all scurrying around and having a whale of a good time. But one of the things that they're doing is that they are chewing the roots inside these banks, and they're killing the Spartina. And they're causing anywhere, in some places, 2 and 3, 4 feet of erosion of these banks. This piece right here is just going to march its way down on this mud flat over the wintertime and be lost. So green crabs are having all kinds of damage. And in fact, I'll come back to McCoy Bay in just a minute. This is another one of those early exercises in history where if we look at this 74-year average from 1880 in Maine to 1960, there's about 6.75 million pounds per year, and this is the whole clam being weighed. But if you look at what was happening during that warm spell that we had in the early 1950s, the 6-year average dropped to 2.98 million pounds per year and put a lot of clammers out of work. In fact, my father was a clammer in the Jonesport area during this time. He graduated in high school in 1950 and clammed for a couple of years and couldn't make any money. And so he became a teacher, went to the University of Maine at Machias when it was called Washington State Teachers College. He got a degree and became a teacher. And a lot of other people just simply stopped clamming during this time because they just couldn't make enough money. One more of these, and then we're off to the races on something else. But again, here's that anomaly, this area here that became, this time that became so warm. And then it was followed by some cold weather. And you can see that through the 1960s and early 70s, we had some fairly good, cold, old-fashioned winters. If we look at 2006, 2007, and then again in 2010, we're back in that warm cycle, and I don't know. We did have quite a cold winter, and who's to say that we're not going to end up having more cold winters, but these recent increases in seawater temperature have been associated with the kind of rapid explosion in green crab populations, especially here in Casco Bay, that were noted and spotted in the 1950s. To just one more time drive the point home, I took that same data set and using the quote from the literature from two different papers that feeding by green crabs appears to be suppressed by seawater temperatures below 7 degrees Celsius. Let's see, 7 degrees Celsius. 10 degrees is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 degrees is 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's somewhere around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But look what was happening in the 1950s. The y-axis shows the number of months with temperatures less than 7 degrees, and there's only a few months. So, that circle there means that there was a fairly warm spell, and we can see that it's happening again more recently. But again, we'll see if that trend continues. So that takes us up to the 2012-2013 time frame, and there was a fellow here from Casco Bay that visited me at the Down East Institute in Beal, which also serves as UMM's Marine Field Station. And he's been a mussel grower here in Casco Bay for quite some time, but all he used to do was to put out ropes, dangle them from a raft, and then, basically pray to the zooplankton gods for mussel larvae to settle on these ropes, and there they go, no problem at all. But something happened, and in 2012, he'd just gone through in 2011 a year where the settlement on his ropes was very patchy, and he wasn't getting much at all. So he came down to DEI and asked whether or not we could actually culture blue mussels. And it turns out that there was a company down east that asked us to do the same thing, and we started working with them, and this has turned into an NSF project. And the reason why NSF was interested is that no one in their right mind would ever think of culturing a blue mussel, since they're all over the place, and all of a sudden they're not there. And now how do you culture them? How many do you put on ropes? When do you deploy these ropes? What kind of material do you use? So all these very practical sorts of questions allowed us to entice the National Science Foundation to fund some projects that we're currently doing, culturing blue mussels of all things. This is McCoy Bay, and does anyone have any idea what I'm looking at on the intertidal zone here at McCoy? Somebody said it? It's eelgrass, Ostra marina, that's right. So that's 2001, and I could have shown you the same picture from 2002, 3, 8, 9, 10, okay? So this is 2013. And there is not a blade of grass out there, or maybe a couple. These photos were taken by Hillary Nichols of USGS. Hillary set out an experiment last summer on these flats with some transplanted eelgrass, and she put out fences to try to keep green crabs at bay. And then she had control areas where green crabs could come in and do whatever they wanted to do with the eelgrass transplants. And the only transplants that survived were the ones that were fenced and that were protected by green crabs. It's an indirect way of suggesting that green crabs have a role, or had a role, in this disappearance. And you can find from time to time small shreds of eelgrass in their gut, so we know that they can't consume it. It also could be that they're just simply so many and that they're disturbing the flat enough so that they're killing the eelgrass. But there's a habitat loss. Rock crabs, Cancer irroratus, come into the intertidal and can prey on clams. And we don't know that they eat eelgrass, but we've caught rock crabs when we put traps out in the intertidal to try to catch green crabs. We've also caught some rock crabs. And this is a quote from Chad Coffin, who's the president of the Maine Clammers Association in 2013 to MPBN Radio. The Maine shellfish industry is in deep trouble. We think that we're only maybe 2 years away from really no commercial viability in the state on soft-shell clams, which has been historically and traditionally one of the most important and economically valuable resources on the coast of Maine. And it was in 2013 that the town of Freeport funded, I'm going to call it a pilot study. I'm calling it a pilot study because it has led to the current work that's been going on. But they used some funding to get clammers and other volunteers to work with me and Darcy Kutra to collect some information about green crabs, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Prior to that, in 2010, an assessment was done by MER Assessment Corporation, Chris Heinig, over in Harpswell. The town of Yarmouth hired him to go in and assess the clam flats and the population of clams there. And in this very blurry distribution of sizes, you can see that we have a fairly healthy population of soft-shell clams. I say that because there's a lot of adults there. That line is the line for the legal limit, and the legal limit is 50 millimeters, or about 2 inches. So anything to the right of that dotted line is a legal clam, and anything to the left is a sublegal clam. And so if you're a clammer and you're looking at that kind of distribution, you're saying, I've got healthy flats now, and I've got things coming along, and I'll be able to clam in future. 3 years later, in the same area, those clams that were the future from 2010 certainly grew to that commercial size, and at high densities. 312 bushel per acre is phenomenal. But take a look at what's coming behind them. And if you're a clammer, that's not good news at all. And it turns out that that same kind of result occurred when we took samples, not very many, but enough to get an idea of trends. So we took core samples, and this fellow in the lower right-hand corner is taking a coffee can that has a hole in it, and he's pushing it down in the mud. He's going to put a cork in it, right, Vicki? And then pull that thing out, and he gets a volume of mud. And it doesn't make any difference if he takes the sample there or she takes the sample there or there. It's always going to be the same surface area and the same volume. And then what we do is we run those through a sieve, spray the mud out, and see what we have for clams. So we took samples at the far right is the lowest tide, and then in the middle is the mid tide, and then we took samples from the upper intertidal. And what we found at the low and the mid was nothing in any of those 20 cores from both places. We did find some clams, not very many legal size, but some small ones even in the plots up above. But it turns out that if we had taken these same core samples, and we did do this, I'm not presenting the results here, at various flats around the Harrisicid and the Wolf Neck region, there's no clams from the mid-intertidal to the low. They're gone. And it happened gradually, is what I've been told, but now the clammers are harvesting. It doesn't make any difference. You know, we've just gone through a series of just absolutely phenomenal tides. You all saw those beautiful full moons, and it's you know, when we look at the causes of the tide, the major cause of the tide is the gravitational attraction of the moon on the Earth. And so when we have these huge full moons, as well as new moons, the moon is close to the Earth, and there's a huge attraction. And so we get high tides and very, very low tides. And, you know, you can go out to the lowest tide flat, and that's where a lot of clammers used to go go clamming. No more. So what they're doing is they're using the subsidy that has built up in the high intertidal over I don't know how many years, and that's where they're focused. So it doesn't make any difference if it's a really great tide with you can walk out in the flats forever, or just a normal tide. All the clammers are rimmed up, I'd say, in a zone that's probably no more than 8 or 10 feet around that whole Harriseket River. And you won't find them out in the middle of any cove because there's nothing there to get. And how long that resource at the high water mark is going to last is anyone's guess, but my guess is not very long. And that Chad Coffin's probably right. So in 2013, we were able to start these pilot studies, and clammers volunteered, and they used a kind of trap called an Acer trap that's made by a gentleman in Waldoboro named Abden Simmons. And these traps fish very well, and they're very easy to dump into totes. And what we did was we were consistent last year and also this year in the kind of bait that we're using. We didn't want to use herring or redfish or anything like that because we didn't want to have a false attractant. We didn't want to use something that wasn't there and be accused of actually tolling in the crabs. So all the scent that comes from crushed up soft-shell clams is scent that's common to a flat because there's soft-shell clams there. So we use clams for bait, which is a very expensive bait. Nonetheless, we trapped in the upper Harriseket in 5 areas, and fishermen would haul a series of 5 traps, sometimes regularly, sometimes not, but most times regularly, by letting it set for about 3 days. And we collected data from the 27th of May to the 5th of November. And every time that a fisherman would come in with his catch, we would record the total weight from the 5 traps. And that would also record where the traps were located and how many of the 5, because sometimes a trap might have gotten lost or hung down or whatever. So we recorded the number of traps fished, how many days it was out there, which I'm calling soak time. And then we weighed the sample, and then we would take a 10% subsample from that. And of that 10% subsample, every crab was measured, the carapace width of every crab was measured, and it was sexed. And then we determined whether or not, if it was a female, whether it was eggs or it had eggs or not. So we used the scale. We would weigh the catch. This one says 61.8, which would be 61.8 pounds that would have come from 5 traps. And then again, we would have gone in the upper right-hand corner with a scoop and just randomly taken crabs from the sample and again measured them. And we had a fellow named Connor O'Neill. Connor's from Freeport, and he volunteered for a few days in June to do a study that I was interested in having him do, which was, okay, what happens if we keep the traps out for a few days, or what would happen if we kept them out for 1 day or 2 days? So, and does that affect the catch? So it was, we did what we call an immersion or soak time study. It was pretty straightforward. Traps were either out for 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days. 5 traps were fished in each of 3 locations for that period of time. And the data shows that the catch was independent of the number of days that those traps were out there. So if you really, really, really wanted to be a fisherman for green crabs, this graph will tell you what to do in terms of how long to leave your traps out there. And that is fish them every day, or even quicker, you know. Because leaving them out for 3 days doesn't gain you much at all right? So the other thing that we were able to do was to look at the catch per trap. And over the course of all of the days that data was collected from May 27th to the 5th of November, you can see that there's a little bit of a parabola to the catch, but it averages out at between 9 and 10 until you get to about September 5th. And then all of a sudden there's this increase in the catch in these traps. So pulling out all these green crabs, in fact, we pulled out about 13,000 pounds over the course of this time. That had no impact, obviously, on the amount of crabs that were in the Harriseket. So the average across all dates is about 10.3 pounds per trap. And I want you to remember that 10.3 pound number because you'll see how that contrasts to what we've gotten so far this year. The other thing that I found interesting and surprising was the sex ratio. And so this is a shot of what is the sex ratio in those random samples through time. And you can see that it's mostly male biased. Okay? If you're above that line, the ratio is on the male side, and below the line, the ratio is more females than males. So for most of the time that we sampled, the catch was biased by many more males than females. And as we probably know with lobsters and with rock crabs and Jonah crabs, the males are always larger than the females. So to sum up for 2013, the fishermen, and these were volunteers. These guys weren't getting paid to do this. They had over 300 trap hauls, and when I say a haul, they're fishing anywhere between 1 to 10 traps per haul. The total number of pounds, or the weight landed, was 13,065. The average catch per trap, which includes that high amount at the end, was 10.3 pounds. 11,715 green crabs were measured and sexed. The average carapace width was just slightly over 2 3/4 inches, and the overall sex ratio was certainly male biased, 72 to 28. I want you to remember that number in a minute as well. Okay, so that takes care of some of the things that we did with green crabs in 2013. I haven't reported on any of the soft shell clam work, but some other time. What we've been able to do this year, and we've gotten funding, and I know that the reason why we've gotten funding from the University of Maine system to do this. We've also gotten funding from the National Fisheries Service through the Stahl Kennedy Award, and from a nonprofit called CPACT. And all three of those combined has allowed us to do some refinements of what we did in 2013. So the first thing that I wanted to find out was, well, what's happening in the lower part of the Harrisicate as well as the upper part. So we've essentially, in the upper part, which is G, F, H, I, and J there, we've placed our traps in mostly the same areas that we had in 2013. And now we've expanded it to the lower part. And in each part of the river, upper or lower, 3 sets of 5 traps each are intertidal. So 15 traps are intertidal, and 2 sets of 5 or 10 traps are subtidal. The subtidal are H and F, and D and E. The intertidal ones are at A, B. I'm sorry. The subtidal ones are at C and E. The E is near the yacht club. The C is near the opening of the Harrisicate to the bay. A is at Spar Cove, B is at Staples Cove, and D is near the LL Bean, what's it called? Kayaks. Yeah, there we go. So that's what we're doing, and we're fishing these traps 3 days a week on a 1-day, a 2-day, and a 4-day soak. So we're still doing that study as well. And I wanted to share with you on the data that I took on water temperature. So when we first started, and you'll see in the upcoming slides, when we started in the 5th of May this year to catch green crabs with traps all over the Harrisicate, some of them had nothing in them for weeks at a time. Some of them had 1 crab. Some of them had 3 crabs. And we knew that we had a very cold December and January. And so we wondered whether or not that cold temperature kind of kept going up until the May time frame. So again, using a website and downloading information from a buoy that's east of southeast of Portland, which isn't exactly the Harrisicate River, but at least it's a point out there in the bay. And so the red circles are seawater temperatures from the 1st of April to the 30th of June in 2013. And the yellow circles are seawater temperatures at the same station. These are surface temperatures from April to the 30th of June, which is the last day that they have for this year at that same station. And you can see that temperatures are significantly higher last year than this year, up until around maybe the middle of May. And then all of a sudden the water temperature are pretty much the same, aren't they, from one year to the next? So that little wrinkle at the beginning of the year, we're wondering whether or not that's associated with what we're seeing, and let's not go any further without showing. So what I've done is I've taken specific dates here. There's data between the 15th of May and the 2nd of June. It's just I haven't worked it up. So what I did was I took data from the first 2 weeks of May, the first 2 weeks of June, the first 2 weeks of July, and the first week of August. So this is current data. And what we can see in the upper Harrisicate and in the lower Harrisicate is pretty much the same pattern. And that is that something's going on after the first week of July, and we're getting an increase in the catch. But take a look at that y-axis. Take a look at the catch in pounds per trap, and notice that even with that, quote, dramatic increase to the last date, the pounds per trap is less than 1, and it averaged 10.3 last year. Isn't that interesting? What we're finding is that the catches are 58% higher so far in the lower Harrisicate, and that 4.5 times higher catch rates have occurred in August versus the average of the previous 3 weeks. So stay tuned. Let's see what happens to that line, where we'll be collecting data all the way to at least the 1st of October this year. If we divide the upper Harrisicate into the intertidal traps versus the subtidal traps, the pattern there is that the intertidal, it wins out at a rate that's on average about 46% higher catch rates in intertidal traps. And in the lower Harrisicate, the same pattern, but a little bit higher, higher catches by 77% in the intertidal versus subtidal. And I think what's happening is that they're coming into that intertidal to catch the small clams that are settling on the flats and are growing to those 2, 3, 4, 5 millimeter sizes. Again, we'll be continuing to collect the information, but I think that's why they're headed to the intertidal zone. So we're able to take the data that we've collected, and this has been no volunteers. These guys are being paid to do this. They haven't missed a date since the 5th of May on this 1, 2, and 4 time frame. And although the data look pretty much the same as the pilot study that Connor O'Neill did, by adding a lot more data points to it, there's actually a slight slope that's there. I'm not going to make too much of it, and I'm basically going to say that soak time is independent of catch, but statistically, it tells me that there is a slight slope to that curve. I'm not impressed with it at all, but there it is. And really, it's only one site in the Harrisicate, and it turns out, geez, I can't even get the, well, there it is. Aha. It turns out that there's only one site in the Harrisicate, the intertidal in the lower, that there's really, if I divided all of those 200 points up into 4 different places, upper intertidal, upper subtidal, lower intertidal, lower subtidal, there's only one of them that would actually have a slope by itself. Anyway, another interesting thing that was going on, remember the sex ratio slide that I showed you from 2013, and that it was all male biased? Well, take a look at how it started in 2014. It started all female biased. And it's now cropped back up to that. What did we say that the sex ratio was at the end last year? Or the overall one? 72 to 28. Yeah, and that's about what it is right now in both the upper and lower traps. Females, if you look at the left-hand side here, the upper one is the intertidal, and the bottom one that's lighter green is the subtidal. And those two distributions are no different for females. But they are different for females in the lower, where the subtidal populations are slightly larger than the intertidal populations. If we look at males, both the intertidal and subtidal populations are different in both sections of the river. In the upper intertidal, the crabs are slightly larger, and in the lower intertidal, the subtidal crabs are slightly larger. So there's really no pattern that's consistent, but I just thought you'd be interested in. Finally, we have the average size of these crabs through time. And there's, again, not really a pattern other than you can see that the average is about 46, which is less than 2 inches, but the upper Heracecid females are smaller than the lower Heracecid females. And again, I don't know what this means. It's just coming out of the data. And the same thing for males, where we have the lower males are slightly larger. And what Chad Coffin and others that are helping on this project are thinking is that perhaps we're seeing the animals coming from offshore that are larger, and they're entering the lower Heracecid, and that's where they are. I'm going to end very quickly by talking about the other. So green crab trapping is one of 6 prongs of a study that's currently going on in Freeport with some research funds. And so study 2, I just told you about study 1, that's the green crab trapping. Study 2, we set up in April, and we won't have the results until October, November. But what we've done is that we've built 14 of these 30-foot by 30-foot by 18-inch high fences. The fences are comprised of wood and mesh to try to keep green crabs out of the middle of these plots. And if you looked at a helicopter view of Staples Cove, you'd see that there's 28 plots out there. Each plot is 30 by 30. 14 of those plots are fenced, and 14 of those plots are unfenced as controls. Within each fenced plot, there's actually 4 treatments or 4 sub-experiments going on. Here, and all of these 4 are 14 by 14 feet. So here is a net, and under this net, there's clams from the Down East Institute where we culture them that are about 1/2 inch in size, planted at 20 per square foot. Here, there's clams planted at 20 per square foot, but no net. Here, there's no clams and no net. And here, there's no clams, but there is a net. And what we'll do in November is we'll remove the nets, and we'll take core samples from each of these 4 plots to find out, 1, did we need to fence in the first place? 2, did we need to net in the first place? And we'll look at the amount of wild clams that have settled into these plots. We'll also look at how the hatchery seed has grown and survived, and whether or not the netting or the fencing was important to protect them. It took about 1/2 a tide to put out 1 of these 30 by 30 foot structures. And I have to say, it was amazing what these guys did and the care that they took. And again, I'm apologizing for the quality of these. These are really crisp slides. They're some of my favorite slides, but it's hard to see what's going on. But and in fact, this picture will also be hard to see what's going on. I took this picture on the mudflats, and this is kind of an aside, but not really, because it turns out that these things have somehow put the kibosh to a lot of what I've just done. Does anyone know what these are? You guys, what are they? They're mud snails. Okay, they're Ilianassa, and they're deposit feeders, and so they ingest mud. This is a picture at Staples Cove. I took my camera and I put it right down here, and I snapped the picture about 2 inches off the mud. So, although this is one of my favorite shots, it just shows the density of snails from a snail eye view. So these things are just crawling all over the place, and they're eating mud and they're pooping it out. They're eating mud and they're pooping it out, and that's what a mud snail does for a living. It's a deposit feeder. It digests mud. And now, again, it's unfortunate, but you see these structures here? You see this structure here, this structure here, and here. By the way, the other things are just tons of mud snails, and they're all in an area that's, right in here to here. So there's thousands of mud snails in this area. Any idea what this stuff is? It is ascophyllum, absolutely, rockweed. And do you have any idea what's on top of the ascophyllum? Mud snail egg cases by the bazillions. I can't come up with a better word. This is a net. Not a net, but a net. Sorry. All right. And what's happened is that those mud snails have laid eggs at such high densities on the nets. Underneath each net is a series of 5 toggles, 5 styrofoam floats, and those floats are designed at high tide to buoy that net off the mud so that it won't interfere with the clam feeding or clam settling in there. But the sheer weight of the mud snails, the egg cases, and all of the sediment that has occurred as a result of that have created this madness. And when you wipe the stuff just off the top, when you see black in a marine environment, you've got death. It's horrendous. And I think that a lot of those clams that we planted under those nets have died. And so we have scraped off the egg cases and we've put more buoys on there, but way too late. And so this experiment is going to have to be interpreted in a different light in November. Study 3. Are clams anything like barnacles? Barnacle larvae are attracted to barnacle adults, and that's called a gregarious behavior. If somebody has a gregarious nature to them, they're real chatty and they're real friendly and they just come up and, be my friend. So there's studies that suggest that some bivalves are gregarious settlers. And I've actually done a study in Stockton Springs a few years ago, and I got mixed results. And so I'm doing this study now. So I've given you the life cycle of the soft-shell clam. And when it falls to the mudflat after it metamorphoses, it is the size of, I love to do this. Take your finger and your thumb and put it up to a light or the screen and open it far enough so that you just allow light to go through. You ready? You got it? That's 1 millimeter. Now I want you to divide that 1 millimeter into 1,000 sections. You laugh, but one of those sections is called a micron. And a clam egg, it turns out, is 44 of those microns. And by the time that egg gets to be fertilized and go through all of that planktonic development and settles down, it's 200 microns. And the size of sand grains are sometimes 300 to 400 microns. So these are smaller than grains of sand. Okay? And they're searching for areas to settle. And typically we think that they're hunting for places where they can burrow in. Well, what we're doing now is asking whether or not they're attracted to their own kind. And so we've set up a simple study. It has 6 treatments, and it costs 60 bushel of commercial-sized clams to set this up. It's set up at 2 sites, one at Recompense and one at Spar Cove in the lower intertidal. And the treatments are clams at 1 bushel per 2 meter by 2 meter plot, or 1 bushel of clams that's now protected by nets that haven't had eggs laid on them, or 2 bushel of clams, and these clams are actually planted by hand. And this was called the hardest thing that I've ever done by several of the clammers that helped do this. And then we've also put nets over some of those plots. And then we have our controls, which are no clams without any mesh, or no clams that have mesh. So there's 6 treatments, and each treatment is replicated 5 times. And the experiment is replicated at 2 different sites. In the fall, we'll take our core samples in these plots and ask, are there any more clams that show up in a plot that has 2 bushel versus none? Or did it make any difference whether or not it was protected with netting or not? So that should give us some pretty good information about gregarious settling of soft-shell clams. So study 4 is coastal acidification. And we're working on this one with some help from the Friends of Casco Bay, who we asked to go out and take some samples on mudflats around the Harrisicot and the Wolf Neck area and tell us which clam flat has the lowest pH. Okay? And that's where we want to set up this experiment. So we found that flat, and it turns out that my brother-in-law is a clam buyer down east, and I can find all kinds of shells. And shells are made out of calcium, and so if you add this to mudflats, perhaps you might be able to buffer that pH and actually increase rather than decrease the pH of the flat. And so although this looks like the same design of the last one, it's different. We're adding crushed shell to 10-foot by 10-foot plots, either at no crushed shells per plot, or 13 pounds per plot, or 26 pounds per plot. And for those three treatments, we're also doubling it by adding netting to the 0, the 13, and the 26. And so this is what they look like on the 18th of May when we put these out. There's a control plot that's netted. There's a 26 pound of shell without a net. And there's a 13 pound with a net. So again, we've got a lot of work to do in November when we take core samples from each of these plots and ask whether or not we're finding any more wild softshell clam juveniles, or they call the 0-year class juveniles, versus are there more in the crushed clamshell plots, or did it make any difference by adding this shell? The fifth study is using hatchery seed planted at 20 or 40 per square foot under nets that are 14 feet wide and 22 feet long. And they're put out in blocks of 4 or groups of 4. And in some of those groups, you see there's a structure there. And that structure is a green crab trap that's fished twice a week. So we're asking, can we protect them with netting? And do we get any better protection if we add a green crab trap? And here's some at Collins Cove near the marina in Freeport. And we have some across the river from that on the Wolf Neck side. And here's one of the traps that we're using in one of those blocks. We went in the 12th of July. This is about 2 months after the study was started, and we took some cores underneath some of the nets, sprayed them through a 2-millimeter mesh, and this is the size. These hatchery clams leave a mark in the shell that's identical to the size that they were planted at. And so you can take calipers and measure, this clam was 14.6 millimeters on the 21st of April, and now you can measure how much it's grown, and it turns out that many of these clams have reached 1.5 inches in that very short 2-month window. We're very, very encouraged by those results. And the last study is one of my favorites, and it's really the first time that I've been able to do this because the seawater temperatures are so cold in Beal's Island where these clams originate that we can't do what I'm going to show you there. How many clams are sitting there on this paper towel? I'll give you a hint. The clams are 1.5 millimeters, 50,000. 50,000 clams on that paper towel, all right? All right, so bear with me. We're almost done, I promise. This is a 20-foot by 2-foot wide by 2-foot deep tank, fiberglass, and it has 10 3-inch pieces of PVC that come out both sides. So far, so good? All right, there's the inside of this tank. Also on the inside of the tank is a 1-horsepower pump that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Okay? This pump and this tank sit between and are attached to 2 floats. And so the whole thing is 20 feet by 14 feet wide. It was launched on the 5th of June at the Coffin Wharf in Harrisika. And there it sits. And those barrels or silos are plastic, and they're 55-gallon Kikkoman soy sauce barrels. Where what we've done is we've cut the top of it off and put it on the bottom, but in doing so, we've added a piece of mesh, like window screening, to the bottom, okay? And so what we're going to do then is take those 50,000 clams and put 50,000 into each of the 20 barrels. Good, it's 1 million clams in that upweller. 1 million, okay? So we're going to put 50,000 in each barrel, and they're just going to fall and hit the screen. And the way in which this upweller works is that the only way that water can get into that tank, because of the way this is designed, is it has to come up through the bottom of every one of those barrels to get inside the water, to get inside the tank. So water's constantly coming up through the bottoms of those barrels, and the bottom of the barrels are filled with clams. So the clams are able to filter the seawater that's rushing past them. Okay? And that's why this is called an upweller or a bivalve nursery, because it works with oysters or hard clams or whatever. So from time to time, this needs to be cleaned, and so the 6th of June, okay, is the date that we put the clams in. Now, in Beal's Island, we want to grow clams to a transplantable size, and we have this hatchery. And we put them out as 3-millimeter animals in trays that are window screen lined and wooden, and they float on the surface of a cove. And we've got 500 to 600 of these trays floating in the surface of a cove. That's the area that we have to take up, because an upweller doesn't work down east because the water temperatures are so cold. It takes from June until November to grow those clams from 3 millimeters to 15 millimeters, which is slightly larger than a half an inch. June to November. This is 37 days in the Harrisika to 15 millimeters from 1.5 for 1 million clams. I've never seen clams grow so fast in my life. Grow so fast that we actually had to empty several of the barrels because the volume when we put them in as just the 1.5 millimeter, they sink to the bottom, and you can still see the mesh on the bottom. But after 37 days, the volume is such that they're this deep in each one of those barrels. The volume has increased so much. So that's the spiel. These are the people, and this is the source of funding: UMM, University of Maine System, Town of Freeport, CPAC, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Down East Institute, and some of the folks that have been instrumental in helping on this project, both in 2013 and this year, is Chad Coffin and Clint Goodenough of Clammers in Freeport, Sarah Randall, who is the local coordinator for this project down in Freeport, and Connor O'Neill, a student from Colby College, who is doing an intern with me this summer. And so that's what I have to say.